There's a photograph of her from 1944. Green eyes staring through the camera, not at it. A face so perfectly arranged it almost doesn't look real. Jean Tierney, they said, was the most beautiful woman in movie history. But if you look closely at that photograph, really look, you can see something else entirely. Something haunted, something that knew what was coming. This is the story of a woman who had everything the world could offer and watched it all slip through her fingers like water. A story of fame and illness, of love and betrayal, of a single moment of kindness that would destroy 2 lives forever. The Gilded Cage, Brooklyn, November 19, 1920. Jean Eliza Tierney arrived into a world that had already decided what she would become. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a successful insurance broker who moved in circles where money whispered instead of shouted. The Tierney home wasn't just wealthy. It was proper. The kind of proper that came with rules about which fork to use and which families were suitable for association. Her mother, Belle, had once taught physical education, moving through the world with purpose and strength. But marriage had transformed her into something else, a keeper of social codes and expectations. Now she taught her daughter different lessons. How to hold a teacup without making a sound. How to enter a room so every eye would turn, but no one could say why. How to laugh at a man's joke even when it wasn't funny. How to become the kind of woman who married well and never caused a scandal. Jean had an older brother, Butch, and a younger sister, Pat. The family lived in Westport, Connecticut, where the lawns stretched wider than most people's dreams, and the houses sat far enough apart that you could pretend you were the only people in the world. Jean attended St. Margaret's School, then the Unqua School. She was sent to brilliant Mont International School in Lausanne, Switzerland, where she spent 3 years learning to be the kind of cosmopolitan young woman who could navigate any drawing room in any country. She learned French until it flowed as easily as English. She learned Italian. She wrote poetry in journals no one would read, verses about night and loneliness that her school magazine published once, as if her interior life was something that could be contained in stanzas. She was being groomed for a very specific kind of life, one measured in country club memberships and suitable marriages, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd done everything right. But Jean had other plans. Or rather, she had a feeling that there had to be something more than this. Something that made her heart beat faster than any tennis match or society luncheon ever could. At 17, she made her society debut. It was September 24, 1938, and she wore white as was expected. She smiled at the right moments, danced with the right young men, said all the things a debutante should say, and inside she was screaming with boredom. 2 months later, she was carrying a bucket of water across a Broadway stage. Her father had resisted at first. Acting wasn't for girls from good families. But Jean possessed something that would define her entire life. A quiet determination that looked like gentleness, but was actually steel. She studied with a Broadway director named Bino Schneider in a small Greenwich Village studio. She took whatever roles she could get. That bucket of water was her first Broadway appearance in a play called What a Life. A Variety critic wrote that she was certainly the most beautiful water carrier he'd ever seen. It wasn't exactly praise for her acting, but it was a start. By 1940, she'd landed a role in The Male Animal. The production was a hit, and Jean's face appeared in Life magazine. She was photographed for Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. At 19 years old, she was already something more than just another pretty girl trying to make it in show business. She was becoming an image, an idea, a fantasy. Broadway critics started paying attention. One called her a promising young actress. Another focused on her looks. They always focused on her looks. Jean's beauty was the kind that made people stop talking mid-sentence. High cheekbones that caught the light. An overbite that should have been a flaw, but somehow made her more intriguing. And those eyes green like sea glass, like something pulled from the ocean and polished smooth. One night Darryl F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox, came to see the show. During the performance, he told his assistant to note Tion's name. He wanted to meet that actress after the show. Later that same night at the Stock Club, he saw a young woman on the dance floor moving with an elegance that seemed effortless and told his assistant to forget the actress from the theater and sign that woman instead. It was Jean Tierney. Zanuck hadn't recognized her. This would become a pattern in her life. Jean had a chameleonic quality, a way of transforming herself that went beyond makeup or costumes. She could be the ingenue one moment and the sophisticate the next, the girl next door or the exotic temptress. People never quite knew what they were getting with Jean Tierney. She would later say she had several different looks, a quality that proved useful in her career. But what it really meant was that Jean Tierney was already disappearing, already becoming whatever people needed her to be. The girl from Connecticut who wrote poetry and dreamed of something more was receding. The image was taking over. Zanuck signed her to a contract with 20th Century Fox. Jean was 20 years old and Hollywood had just opened its doors. But what was waiting for her there would be far more complicated than anything she'd imagined. The machine. Hollywood in 1940 was a machine that turned beautiful girls into stars and stars into products. Jean Tierney fed herself into that machine willingly. Her first film was The Return of Frank James, a Western directed by Fritz Lang opposite Henry Fonda. She was 20 years old and terrified. Lang was a tyrant on set, but Jean watched and learned. This was the price of the dream. The roles came quickly after that. Tobacco Road, where she played a barefoot hillbilly named Ellie Mae. Director John Ford cast her in a role that was all sexuality and earthiness, about as far from her Connecticut upbringing as you could get. The Shanghai Gesture, where she wore increasingly wild costumes designed by the man who would soon become her husband, playing a character who descended into alcoholic and sexual excess. Belle's Star, Sundown, where even the unflappable George Sanders looked momentarily undone by her entrance into a scene. Son of Fury, the studio was figuring out what to do with her. They'd cast her in westerns, melodramas, adventure films. Sometimes she was the good girl. Sometimes she was dangerous. The roles kept coming. But Jean was still learning, still finding her way as an actress. In 1941, she eloped with Oleg Cassini, a costume designer who worked at Paramount. He was handsome and charming with dark eyes and continental manners. He came from European nobility, a count's son who'd fled the Russian Revolution as a child. He had sophistication and style and a reputation for knowing his way around women. Her family was horrified. Oleg was Catholic and Jean was Episcopalian. He was divorced, which meant scandal in their circles. He had a playboy reputation that preceded him wherever he went. This was not the suitable marriage Belle Tierney had spent years preparing her daughter for. But Jean was in love, or thought she was, or maybe just wanted to be free of all those expectations that had followed her from Connecticut to Broadway to Hollywood. They married anyway in a quick ceremony that made headlines. For a while, it seemed like Jean Tierney had managed to outrun every expectation placed upon her. She was a movie star. She was married to a sophisticated European. She was working with the best directors in Hollywood. She was 20 years old and at the beginning of everything. The cracks came later. They always do. Oleg designed costumes for Jean's films when he could, creating elaborate gowns that made the most of her figure and coloring. He understood how to present her to maximum effect. But he also understood how to charm other actresses. And the rumors started almost immediately. Lana Turner, others. Jean tried not to listen to the gossip that seemed to follow her husband through every Hollywood party. Ernst Lubitsch cast her in Heaven Can Wait in 1943 opposite Donham She. It should have been her breakthrough into comedy, a chance to show she could do more than just look beautiful in melodramas. On set, Lubitsch screamed at her constantly, reducing her to tears. He was a perfectionist who believed in breaking actors down to rebuild them the way he wanted. When she threatened to walk off the picture, he yelled that he was paid to shout at her. She replied with more steel in her voice than anyone expected, that she was paid to take it, but not enough. Lubitsch reportedly laughed, genuinely impressed, and they became friends after that. This was how it worked in Hollywood. You survived the cruelty, and if you survived it with enough grace, enough backbone, people respected you for it. Jean was learning the rules of a game she'd never wanted to play. But 1943 brought something Jean Tierney couldn't survive with grace or grit or any amount of determination. The fan. She was pregnant with her first child and working on Heaven Can Wait. She kept the pregnancy secret because she feared being replaced. This was Hollywood. There was always someone younger, someone more available, someone who wouldn't need time off to have a baby. Jean had seen what happened to actresses who got pregnant at the wrong time. Their careers stalled. Younger women took their roles. The machine kept moving without them. Before leaving Los Angeles to join her husband, Oleg, who was stationed with the army in Kansas, Jean decided to make one final public appearance. The Hollywood Canteen was a club where servicemen could meet stars, get autographs, dance with pretty girls, forget for a few hours that they were heading to war zones they might not return from. It was a patriotic duty. Everyone who was anyone in Hollywood took turns volunteering there. Jean went. The place was packed with young men in uniform. Some were barely 18. Some had already seen combat and had that look in their eyes, that distance that came from witnessing things no one should have to see. Jean moved through the crowd, signing autographs with her perfect penmanship, shaking hands, posing for photographs that these boys would carry with them overseas. She smiled until her face hurt. She listened to stories about hometowns she'd never visit. She danced with soldiers who held her too carefully as if she might break. The boys were so far from home and she could give them this small kindness, this moment of glamour and normally before they shipped out. A few days later she woke up covered in red spots. German measles rubella. In 1943 there was no vaccine. Most people thought it was a harmless childhood disease, something you got as a kid and then forgot about a week of spots and fever and then you were fine. But just 2 years earlier, an Australian eye doctor named Norman Gregg had discovered something that would change everything. He'd noticed an unusual cluster of babies born with cataracts after a rubella outbreak swept through Sydney in 1940. 20-some infants, all with the same devastating eye damage, all born to mothers who'd had rubella in their first trimester. Gregg dug deeper. The virus, it turned out, could cross the placental barrier. It could attack a developing fetus during those crucial first months when the brain and organs and senses were forming. The damage was permanent, profound. Cataracts, deafness, heart defects, mental disability. This information was just beginning to circulate through medical journals in 1943. It hadn't reached the general public. There was no television news, no internet, no way for crucial medical findings to spread immediately to everyone who needed to know. Jean Tierney didn't know any of this. Her doctor didn't warn her to avoid crowds. No one told her what the red spots might mean for the child she was carrying. She rested for a week, recovered, and went to Kansas to be with Oleg. They made a home in Junction City near Fort Riley where he was stationed. Jean spent the next months preparing for motherhood, decorating a nursery, reading baby books, imagining the life they would have. On October 15, 1943 in Washington, D.C., she gave birth to a premature baby girl. Annette Daria Cassini weighed 3 pounds 2 ounces. She was so small, so fragile. She needed a complete blood transfusion immediately. The doctors ran tests, more tests. Their faces grew graver with each result. Finally, they sat Jean and Oleg down and explained what had happened. Daria was deaf, partially blind with severe cataracts, profoundly mentally disabled, the rubella, the timing, the way the virus had attacked the developing fetus during those crucial first months. There was nothing they could have done. Nothing they could do now. The damage was permanent. Jean listened to all of it, and something inside her broke that would never fully heal. This was her daughter, this tiny girl who would never hear music or see her mother's face clearly or understand the world the way other children would. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything. And instead, it felt like an ending. The encounter. Howard Hughes, the eccentric millionaire who had once pursued Jean romantically, paid for Daria's medical care. Despite his reputation as a recluse who cared about nothing but airplanes and money, Hughes made sure the little girl received the best treatment available. He covered all the expenses, never asked for publicity or gratitude, just did it because he'd cared about Jean once, and this was something he could do. But there was no treatment that could give Daria the life her mother had dreamed for her. No amount of money or care could undo what the virus had done. For 2 years, Jean tried to care for Daria at home. She hired the best nurses money could buy. She read everything she could find about childhood development, about deafness, about brain damage, searching for some hint that her daughter might improve. She hoped, against all medical evidence, that Daria might somehow beat the odds, that love and determination might be enough. She brought Daria to specialists. She tried experimental treatments. She sang to her daughter, even though Daria couldn't hear. She held her and rocked her and tried to find some connection, some moment of recognition in those clouded eyes. Nothing worked. Daria wasn't going to get better. She would need round-the-clock care for the rest of her life. Then came the tennis party. It was 2 years after Daria's birth. Jean was trying to maintain some semblance of normal life, attending social functions, seeing friends, pretending she wasn't falling apart inside. She was at a tennis club with friends when a woman approached her, beaming, gushing about what a huge fan she was. The woman kept talking, explaining that they'd met before at the Hollywood canteen during the war. Jean didn't remember her. The canteen had been full of faces, hundreds of people, all wanting a moment with the stars. The woman seemed disappointed that Jean didn't recall their meeting. She elaborated, trying to make herself memorable. She'd been in the Women's Marine Corps, she explained. She'd been ill that night, actually, but she'd wanted to meet Jean Tierney so badly that she'd broken quarantine to attend. Just couldn't pass up the opportunity, you see. And then, almost as an afterthought, the woman asked if Jean had happened to catch German measles after that night at the canteen. Time stopped. Jean Tierney stood there and understood for the first time exactly what had happened to her daughter. This woman, this smiling, oblivious woman who'd been such a fan that she'd broken medical quarantine to meet a movie star. This single moment of selfishness, this one thoughtless decision had destroyed Daria's life before it even began. She said nothing. The words wouldn't come. What could she say? What would be the point? Screaming at this woman wouldn't cure Daria. It wouldn't give back the hearing or the sight or the intelligence that the Ryubella had stolen. Jean Tierney turned and walked away. She never spoke to that woman again, never reported her, never sought revenge or justice or even an apology. She simply added it to the weight she was already carrying. This knowledge that her daughter's disability had a name and a face and had been completely, utterly preventable. In 1947, when Daria was 4 years old, Jean and Oleg made the decision to institutionalize their daughter. Daria would spend most of her life in care facilities. She would die in 2010 at the age of 66, having never known her mother as anything but a distant, sad presence who visited sometimes. Jean had a second daughter with Oleg in 1948. Christina was healthy, beautiful, everything Daria wasn't, but the damage to Jean's marriage was already complete. The portrait, the year 1944, should have been Jean Tion's triumph. Laura premiered and it made her a legend. Director Otto Preminger had cast her as Laura Hunt, a woman so magnetic that men became obsessed with her even after her supposed death. The film was a noir masterpiece, all shadows and obsession, and that haunting portrait of Jean's face hanging on the wall, while everyone wondered who could have destroyed such beauty. In the film, Laura exists first as a painting, an idealized image that the detective falls in love with before she even appears. When Jean finally walked through the door, alive and real, the question becomes whether the woman can ever live up to the fantasy. It was the perfect metaphor for Jean Tierney's own life. The portrait that hung in the film, the one that became iconic, captured something essential about her. The green eyes that seemed to look past the camera, past the viewer, into some middle distance where the future waited. The slight smile that could mean anything or nothing. The perfection that didn't quite seem human. Critics raved. Audiences packed theaters. Jean Tierney became the woman every man wanted and every woman wanted to be. The image was complete now, seared into the public consciousness. She wasn't just a movie star anymore. She was an icon. But at home, she was watching her marriage disintegrate. The Hollywood that had brought Jean and Oleg together was now tearing them apart. Oleg's infidelities became harder to ignore. There were whispers about him and other actresses. Lana Turner's name came up. Others Jean tried to pretend she didn't hear the gossip that seemed to follow her everywhere. They separated in 1946, came back together briefly when Jean wanted to try one more time to make it work, then separated again when she realized it never would. The marriage had survived Daria's birth, but it couldn't survive everything else, the guilt and blame and distance that had grown between them. Jean threw herself into work, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, where she played a widow who falls in love with a ghost. It was a role that let her be tender and strong, vulnerable but not weak. Working with director Joseph Mankiewicz, she created one of her most affecting performances, The Razor's Edge, where she worked alongside Tyrone Power. Power was beautiful in the way Jean was beautiful, almost too perfect to be real. On set, they circled each other carefully. He was married. She was technically still married. And yet, there was something there, a connection that went deeper than just two attractive people making a movie together. But nothing came of it. Jean was learning that in Hollywood, even genuine connections got complicated by contracts and publicity and the careful management of images. Nothing was ever just what it appeared to be. And then in 1946, she met someone who would change everything. The Blue Eyes. His name was Jack Kennedy. He was a young Navy lieutenant visiting the set of Dragon Wick. And when Jean turned to look into the camera, she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen on a man. She would later write that her heart literally skipped. It was romance novel stuff, the kind of meeting that shouldn't happen in real life, but somehow did. The director had told her to turn and look into the camera, and instead she'd found herself looking at this man in a Navy uniform, and the world had tilted slightly on its axis. Jack Kennedy was 29 years old, charming in that effortless way that some men have. Ambitious in a way that made everything else in his life secondary. He came from a wealthy Boston Irish family that was already planning his political future. His father, Joe Kennedy, had been ambassador to the court of St. James. The family had money and connections and a ruthless determination to accumulate power. Jean was still technically married to Oleg Cassini, though they were separated. She was Episcopalian. He was Catholic. She was a divorce in the making. He was a man with his eye on the White House. His family would never approve of her. Her family had their own reservations about him. None of it mattered. They fell into an affair that consumed them both. Jean would take him to meet her mother in Green's Farms. Jack would bring along political associates, rough men from his father's world who left cigar stubs in ashtrays and talked politics with an edge that made Belle Tierney uncomfortable. These weren't the refined people Jean had been raised to associate with. These were ward healers and fixers, the machinery that kept politicians in power. Her mother couldn't hide her distaste. Once she asked Jean's sister why Jack couldn't get a better class of people around him. The answer was simple. He was a politician, not on a polo team. This was his world, and it was never going to be the world Belle Tierney thought her daughter deserved. Jean's family saw what she couldn't or wouldn't. This relationship had an expiration date written into it from the start. Jack was Catholic and would need to marry a Catholic woman if he wanted his political career to survive. Jean was about to be divorced, which was political poison in the 1940s. She was an actress, which meant she was fundamentally unsuitable as a politician's wife in that era. And maybe Jean knew all this too. Maybe she loved him anyway. Or maybe she loved the idea of him, the beautiful man with the perfect blue eyes who made her feel like she was more than just a face on a screen. They dated for about a year. Jack would visit her when he was in New York or Los Angeles. They'd go to dinner at the Stock Club or other places where they'd be seen because Jack understood the value of being seen with beautiful women. It added to his image, the war hero who dated movie stars. One day they were having lunch in New York. Jack had asked her to meet him and Jean thought maybe this was it. Maybe he was going to propose or at least talk about their future together. Just before some of his friends joined them at the table, Jack looked at her and said out of nowhere that he could never marry her. Just like that. Matter of fact, no preamble. His political career wouldn't survive a marriage to a divorced actress. His father would never allow it. The Catholic Church would never sanction it. Jean sat there as his friends joined them, making small talk, laughing at jokes she didn't hear. When it was time for Jack to leave for his flight back to Washington, she said very quietly, "Goodbye, Jack." The finality in her voice made him stop. He walked back across the room, asked her what she meant. She asked him what he thought she meant. There was a long moment where they looked at each other, both knowing it was over, but neither quite ready to say it out loud. The relationship limped along for a while after that. They'd see each other occasionally. Jean ran into him at El Morocco in 1956, years later when she was deep in her mental health struggles. They danced. The next day he visited her at her mother's apartment, and her mother was afraid to leave them alone, afraid Jean would get hurt again. Jack suggested they go for a walk. Outside, under the street lights of Manhattan, they talked about her illness, about the path her life had taken. Jean told him she'd begun to realize she was one of those people who couldn't handle problems and disappointments by working harder, that maybe she needed to find a different way to survive. But the romance was finished. Years later, Jean would say that no one really broke them up. Not his father, not his mother, not her family. She stopped seeing him because she knew the consequences wouldn't be happy ones. She'd learned by then that sometimes loving someone isn't enough, that the world doesn't care about your feelings if the circumstances are wrong. When Kennedy became president in 1960, Jean sent him a congratulatory note. It was gracious, the kind of thing someone does when they've made peace with the past. She voted for Richard Nixon in that election. Some wounds don't heal. They just stop bleeding. But you remember exactly where they are. The descent. By 1945, Jean Tierney had achieved everything a woman in Hollywood could achieve. She'd been nominated for an Academy Award for Leave Her to Heaven, where she played a woman whose obsessive love destroys everyone around her. Critics called her performance chilling. They had no idea how much of Jean's own darkness she was channeling into that role. The 1940s gave way to the 1950s and the cracks began to show. She dropped out of Mambo in 1953. The official reason was health issues, but everyone knew it was something more. Grace Kelly took the role and became a star. Jean Tierney started to disappear on the set of The Left Hand of God in 1955. She couldn't remember her lines. Humphrey Bogart, her co-star, would feed her dialogue between takes. He was patient with her because his own sister had suffered from mental illness. He recognized the signs. After filming Wrapped, he told Jean privately that she needed help. She was hospitalized at Harkness Pavilion in New York, then the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut. The doctors prescribed electroshock therapy, 27 sessions. The treatment was supposed to cure her depression. Instead, it erased portions of her memory. Jean would later become a vocal opponent of electroshock therapy, speaking publicly about how it had destroyed parts of her life. But in the moment she was drowning and grasping at anything that might save her. She fled from the Institute of Living, she was caught and returned. The cycle continued. Manic episodes where she couldn't stop spending money, buying things she didn't need, making plans she couldn't follow through on. Then the crashes where she couldn't get out of bed for days, where the weight of everything she'd lost felt too heavy to carry. Her second daughter, Christina, came home from school one day in December 1957 to find their apartment building surrounded by police and neighbors. Jean was on the ledge of their mother's apartment 14 stories up. For 20 minutes, she stood there looking down. 20 minutes deciding whether to jump. She didn't. The police talked her down. She stepped back inside. But something had changed. Jean Tierney had reached the absolute bottom of her despair, and she'd chosen to live anyway. The healing. The Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, was different from the other institutions Jean had been in. They didn't just throw medication at her or strap her down for shock treatments. They tried to understand what was happening in her mind. They gave her space to heal. Part of her treatment involved working as a salesgirl at Tolmage's ladies' apparel shop in a nearby town anonymously without anyone knowing she was Jean Tierney, Hollywood star. She helped customers find dresses. She made small talk about the weather. She practiced being a regular person again. It lasted until the press found out. Then the photographers showed up and Jean's brief taste of normal life evaporated. She spent 18 months at the Institute of Living, then 8 months at Menninger. Slowly, carefully, she began to put herself back together. In 1958, she declared herself ready to work again. 20th Century Fox had continued paying her salary through all her years of absence, and now she returned to the studio that had made her a star. People rushed to greet her, to hug her, to welcome her home. In interviews, she spoke with remarkable frankness about where she'd been. She talked about breaking down, about treatment, about working in that dress shop. This was before it became common for celebrities to discuss mental illness publicly. Jean Tierney was breaking ground simply by admitting she'd needed help. She made a few more films. Advise and Consent in 1962, where she had a small but memorable role. The Pleasure Seekers in 1964, which would be her last theatrical film. But her heart wasn't in Hollywood anymore. She'd found something better. The oil man. His name was W. Howard Lee, and he was a Texas oil executive. He'd been married before to actress Hedy Lamarr. A marriage that had ended badly in 1960 with a bitter court battle over alimony. Jean met Howard that same year, and they married on July 11, 1960 at the Aspen Community Church in Aspen, Colorado. She was 39, he was 51. They were both wounded by their previous marriages, both looking for something quieter than what Hollywood offered. They settled in Houston, where Jean lived for the next 31 years. She wrote a newspaper column. She became an expert at contract bridge. She traveled with Howard. She participated in civic and charitable causes. It was, by all accounts, a happy marriage. Howard was steady, supportive, devoted. He helped Jean through the rough patches that still came, the days when the depression crept back in. He never asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. When Jean discovered she was pregnant in 1960, she and Howard were both overjoyed. She'd withdrawn from a film called Return to Peyton Place to prepare for the baby. But then she miscarried and something in Jean broke all over again. She retreated from public life even further. She made a few television appearances over the years. Her final role was in the 1980 miniseries Scruples. By then she was 60 years old and looked nothing like the ethereal beauty from Laura. Decades of smoking had taken their toll. Her hands shook. Her voice was rough. But she was still Jean Tierney, still capable of capturing something on camera that couldn't quite be explained. Howard Lee died on February 16, 1981 after a long illness. Jean was 60 years old and suddenly alone. She never remarried. Friends said she would sometimes call her first husband, Oleg Cassini, in the middle of the night and talk to him as if it was still 1943, as if none of the tragedy had happened yet, as if they were still young and in love. And Daria hadn't been born with those devastating disabilities. Jean published her autobiography, Self-Portrait, in 1979. In it she wrote with painful honesty about her mental illness, her treatment, her failures as a mother, her regrets. She dedicated it to her daughters. Christina died in 2015 at age 66, the same age Daria had been when she died in 2010. Jean herself had died 14 years earlier on November 6, 1991, just 13 days before her 71st birthday. Jean Tierney passed away in Houston from emphysema. She'd smoked for most of her life, starting after watching her first movie because she thought her voice sounded too high and wanted to make it deeper. Even at the end, she was trying to transform herself into what she thought people wanted to see. The legacy. What do we make of a life like Jean Tierney? There's the story Hollywood tells. The glamorous actress with the perfect face who fell from grace. There's the medical story, the woman with untreated bipolar disorder who suffered through barbaric treatments until she finally found help. There's the tragedy of Daria, the daughter who never had a chance because of fan-broke quarantine. But maybe the real story is simpler and more complicated than any of those. Jean Tierney was a woman who spent her entire life becoming what other people needed her to be. The debutante her parents wanted. The star Daryl Zanuck created. The fantasy men projected onto movie screens. The cautionary tale of Hollywood excess. The brave survivor who spoke publicly about mental illness. She played all those roles brilliantly. But who was Jean Tierney when no one was watching? Did she even know? In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, there's a scene where Jean's character is told that the life she thought she'd lived was actually just a dream. Everything she believed was real turned out to be something else entirely. Jean Tierney's life had that same quality. The beauty that should have been enough but never was. The fame that brought no peace. The moments of happiness that slipped away before she could hold on to them. She survived all of it. She found love again. She built a quiet life in Texas, far from the cameras and the constant scrutiny. She wrote her truth down and let the world read it. But the image of her from Laura, those green eyes staring through the camera, remains the thing we remember most. The fantasy, the dream girl, the most beautiful woman in movie history. Not the woman who stood on a ledge and chose to live. Not the mother who lost one daughter to illness and watched the other grow up while fighting her own demons. Not the survivor who spent years in treatment and came out the other side to tell her story. Just that face. Just that image. Just that impossible ethereal beauty. Tierney knew better than anyone how little beauty actually protects you. How it can become a prison of other people's expectations. How the world loves to build you up and watch you fall. She fell and then she got back up. And then she lived another 30 years doing exactly what she wanted, away from all the noise. Maybe that's the real triumph. Not the Oscar nomination or the iconic films or the famous lovers, but the quiet decision to survive, to heal, to find happiness on her own terms. Tierney's life was a tragedy, but it was also a victory. She lived to tell her own story in her own words, and she lived long enough to find peace. That's something Laura never got. The dream girl in the painting, frozen in time, perfect and unreal. Tierney was real, flawed and complicated and wounded and strong. And her story deserves to be remembered, not just for the tragedy, but for the courage it took to survive it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.